A sudden collapse creates resistance. People react. They revolt. They demand change. Systems are forced to respond when failure is loud. But slow erosion does something very different. It trains people to accept less, without ever calling it loss. Lower expectations, shorter horizons, smaller ambitions. And an empire built on lowered expectations doesn't need to be conquered. It simply stops expanding. At first, this looks like maturity. People call it realism. They say they're being practical. They stop dreaming big. They stop planning far ahead. Not because they don't want to, but because long-term thinking starts to feel irresponsible. And that's the shift. When the future feels risky, society begins to shrink inward. Inflation doesn't just shrink savings, it reshapes behavior. People stop asking, "What could I build?" They start asking, "What can I protect?" Capital becomes defensive. Energy turns inward. And a society focused on defense loses its ability to grow. Even if it looks productive, even if it looks busy. Over time, inflation creates a divide. Not between rich and poor, but between those who can move and those who must wait. Those who can reposition adapt faster than inflation erodes them. Those who cannot fall behind quietly. Not through failure, through timing. Assets move. Debt adjusts, institutions adapt, but wages move slowly, savings move slowly, and what moves slowly loses ground. Not because it's wrong, but because it's late. This is why inflation feels unfair without ever feeling violent. No one is attacked. No one is singled out. Everyone loses at a slightly different pace. And because loss is uneven, solidarity weakens. People stop seeing a shared problem. They see personal struggles. This is the most dangerous stage, because collective pressure disappears. Everyone thinks they are alone in the adjustment. They think others are managing better. They assume the problem is personal. And systems survive longer when people internalize systemic failure. Inflation is rarely resisted because it rarely feels urgent. People don't fight what they can still endure. They adapt to it, and adaptation feels like control, but it isn't. It's surrender disguised as responsibility. Inflation doesn't announce itself as destruction. It presents itself as necessity, as management, as something temporary that just lasts a little longer every year. And because nothing breaks all at once, people wait. They assume the correction will come. They believe balance will return. But inflation isn't a moment. It's a process. And processes don't reverse themselves without force. They simply continue until something gives. This is the stage where empires quietly weaken. Not because enemies are stronger, but because the internal math no longer works. Promises cost more than the system can deliver. And no reform feels sufficient because the damage is cumulative. Every empire believes it will manage this better, that it will stop in time, that inflation can be controlled without consequences. History disagrees, not because leaders were evil, but because quiet tools are always more tempting than painful ones. Inflation buys time, and buying time feels safe. But time is never free. The cost is always paid later, by someone else, in a different form. Inflation doesn't destroy empires by removing money. It destroys them by removing meaning. The currency remains. The numbers remain. But the promises attached to them slowly disappear. Trust fades quietly. Confidence erodes invisibly. And when trust fades slowly, no one notices until the structure is hollow. Empires don't collapse when money disappears. They collapse when money stays, but no longer does what it promised. When effort stops translating into progress, when stability stops feeling real, Inflation doesn't scream. It doesn't warn. It doesn't threaten. It waits. And by the time it's loud, the empire is already finished. Nothing feels broken. Your job still exists. Stores are still open. Money is still moving. There are no riots, no empty shelves, no dramatic collapse. And that's exactly why this works. Because the most dangerous economic destruction doesn't announce itself. It whispers. Empires don't fall when people panic. They fall when people adjust. And inflation is the quietest adjustment mechanism ever created. Most people think inflation is about prices, gas prices, food prices, rent. But that's not what inflation really destroys. Inflation destroys time. It changes what the future costs without changing how the present feels. And that gap between what feels normal and what is actually happening is where empires start to decay. At first, inflation feels manageable. You notice prices rising, but you also notice yourself adapting. You buy slightly less. You postpone a plan. You accept a compromise. Life continues. And as long as life continues, the system looks stable. This is the most deceptive phase. Because stability isn't the same as health. It's just the absence of visible failure. Here's the part most people miss. When inflation begins, people believe they are responding. They cut back. They optimize. They get smarter with money. This feels responsible. But adaptation is not control. Adaptation is what happens after control is already gone. Inflation doesn't punish recklessness first. It punishes patience. Throughout history, states faced the same dilemma. Wars were expensive. Administrations grew larger. Promises multiplied. Raising taxes was dangerous. Cutting spending was unpopular. So they chose the quiet option. They altered money, not enough to cause panic, just enough to buy time. And buying time felt like solving the problem. But it never was. Rome didn't wake up one morning and discover its money was worthless. The denarius still circulated. Coins still changed hands. But slowly, the metal content declined. Not dramatically. Gradually. Each generation trusted the currency slightly less than the one before. Nothing collapsed immediately. But trust eroded at the same pace as value. And this is where the pattern begins. Because slow destruction is always more effective than sudden collapse,